we do all have a core, and it's not another person, and it's not another saint even that we can find, our path. Like we really do all have a unique path. Yeah. And even one of our saints, Saint Edith Stein, in her philosophical works, kind of unpacks that. How there's a certain core to the person that nothing else can enter except God.
And it's totally unique to that person. Like so totally unique that it's not copied anywhere else.
Yes.
Okay, God has imparted each person with this very, very special and just divine calling that we should respond to.
Yes, and that's what he wants. He doesn't want another Thérèse. He doesn't want another Elizabeth. He wants you.
Praise be Jesus Christ, and welcome to another episode of CarmelCast. CarmelCast is a production of ICS Publications. For more information, you can visit our website at www.icspublications.org. I'm Brother John Mary of Jesus Crucified, and I'm joined today by Father Michael Joseph of St. Thérèse. And this season on CarmelCast, we are discussing the life and the spirituality of St. Elizabeth of the Trinity. And I'm especially excited about this episode because we're going to be talking about the influence and the similarities and differences between St. Elizabeth of the Trinity and another great Carmelite nun from France, St. Thérèse. And so I'm glad to have you with me, Father Michael Joseph, because I think your name, you have Thérèse in your name, so you have that affinity already with her, and I think there'll be a lot for us to unpack here.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think, you said that St. Elizabeth of the Trinity is your favorite saint. You've made that very clear, and she had a big for drawing you to Carmel. So I think between the both of us, hopefully we can show some of the similarities and kind of go in more in depth into the influence of Thérèse on Elizabeth.
Right. Yeah. So maybe just to conceptualize here the lives of the two of these saints. We have Saint Thérèse, who was born in 1873, and she entered the Carmel in Lisieux, France, which is west of Paris. Mm-hmm. And then we have Elizabeth, who was born just 7 years later in 1880, and she entered the Carmel in Dijon, France, which is in southeast France, closer to Switzerland. Mm-hmm. So the two of them, they lived about 300 miles apart, and their lives actually, they overlapped somewhat. Thérèse died in 1897, but still, the two never met.
No.
They never met in person. They might have. I was actually thinking about this before we recorded. They might have visited some of the same places. Perhaps I don't know for sure. So they could have seen some overlap in their lives, not at the same time, obviously, but. Sure. But they were breathing the same air.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. And even though they had very different backgrounds and different, life experiences, but especially you think of the spirituality of the time, and the church and the preaching, and so their kind of ecclesial experience would probably be very similar,
right?
And the influence that would have had on them,
right? Yeah. So when would you say then? When would their lives kind of first converge? As far as when would Elizabeth have first heard about Thérèse?
Well, I mean, one thing that I kind of enjoy thinking about is that when Elizabeth was first starting to think about her life as a Carmelite, Thérèse was still alive, in the Lisieux Carmel. And so, there already probably was an affinity in some way. There's a hidden affinity. But we know that just a year after Thérèse's death, the original Story of a Soul was published, which was the edited manuscripts of Thérèse that were reconfigured and, in an extraordinary, short amount of time, they were able to be published. And not just 6 months after, in the spring of 1899, Elizabeth was given a copy of Story of a Soul. So, I mean, I think that's really the first convergence, is that almost immediately after the book comes out, Elizabeth has it in her hands and is reading it. So you can see that, this was meant for her. Thérèse going through this and them doing this work of editing and all that, making this thing come out. You can see in God's providence, it was probably very important, so that Elizabeth would have it.
Well, yeah, exactly, because especially it was, this is long before the internet. So today, it'd be very easy maybe to hear news from someone or to read something from someone who lived across the country. But here, in this time, I'd say this is especially miraculous in a sense that Elizabeth would find this in her hands, this book in her hands at this time so quickly after Thérèse's passing.
Yeah, and you think, Thérèse was not, she was just a sister. She was just a Carmelite nun who had died, and who this was a biography written about her that was going to be a circular to send to the other convents and was seen as, no, this has like such value, should be made, available to all. But at that time, no one knew her still, so it's just this book about this random kind of Carmelite nun that had just died. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty incredible how quickly, people started seeing like, whoa, this is something very special.
Oh yeah, and we know that Elizabeth was very much struck by this book right away because that same time when we know that she was reading Story of a Soul, she begins in her diary and in letters particularly using terms that very clearly came from Thérèse. Mm-hmm. And that's where we can see like right away like this was making an impact on Elizabeth. Something in this was speaking to her.
Yes. And I think one of the first things you can draw out is the experience of First Communion. Mm-hmm. That how St. Thérèse, when she received her First Communion, and Elizabeth, when she received her First Communion, it was only 6 or 7 years apart. And that Elizabeth is now 19 reading this experience, but she sees in that like the very words that she would use to describe her own First Communion. So it gives her a kind of vocabulary to describe this very powerful mystical experience that Elizabeth had that now she sees in her sister, and it gives her a language and ability to kind of interpret in a way what happened to her. But of course that experience was already so important. Elizabeth, this is a few years after, but it just gives her this new light in a way to see her own experience.
Right. And that's something that we do too when we read the saints. I think one reason why it's so influential to read the saints, I know in my own life, is the first time I read the biography, the life of Teresa of Avila. I remember reading it and just so many things, and it just spoke to my heart and my own experience and my past. It was like helping me to reframe things that I'd already experienced in the past and to understand them better. And then I imagine too, if for 19-year-old Elizabeth, who had this great desire to become a Carmelite, she was able to look to Thérèse and look forward to her future. Like, what did she want to become in Carmel? So you have her looking ahead to Thérèse as her older sister, 7 years older than her, kind of paving the way in Carmel that Elizabeth herself wanted to follow.
Yeah, so it really did make it kind of like incarnated her.
Yes.
Yeah, her model of like what she was seeking in becoming a Carmelite nun.
Yes.
She had already experienced the grace of that vocation, that desire, but then Thérèse just helped concretize it and give her a real model in that sense. And so, so the challenge is then seeing, how Elizabeth was able to benefit from the reading of Thérèse. How did it help her spiritual life? How did it help her grow and just make her mission more clear?
Yeah. One thing that's interesting is, we have, because of Elizabeth's own writing, we have certain passages that she copied out from reading Story of a Soul that first time. So we know very clearly, like, what was it that was speaking to her. And one thing that's interesting is in that first version of Story of a Soul, they included 3 of the poems that Thérèse wrote. And Elizabeth copied out all 3 of those poems. Now, to some degree, I think it was, certainly the contents of those poems that was speaking to her spiritually. But I also wonder if there was just something about that language, that way of expressing herself too, through poetry, that kind of mystical way of expressing her spirituality that spoke to Elizabeth, because Elizabeth had already begun writing some poetry herself. And so once again, she'd find this kind of affinity with this sister in Thérèse as a way of expressing her deep longing and desire for God.
Yeah, and you think, Elizabeth is she's 19 at this point, or just about 19. So she's already matured a lot in her own mystical life. Yeah. But the very nature of mystical experience often is it's ineffable. It's difficult to explain. It's difficult to put into words. Yeah. And I'm sure Elizabeth struggled with that a lot of kind of how to articulate these things. And so the poetry, Thérèse's poetry in this moment, especially certain poems, just gave her a voice that maybe she was still kind of struggling or trying to trying to articulate.
Yeah. You see that in the poetry of the saints. I think people who maybe are not so used to a life of prayer or this kind of direct experience of God, if they read some poetry of the saints, it might be very difficult for them to understand. It's like, what is this even talking about? But when you've had somewhat of an experience of God yourself, you begin to it like opens the door for you to understand the poetry, and then the poetry opens the door for you to understand your experience. I mean, This was the case for John of the Cross for me. When I first read the poetry of John of the Cross, it's like, I have no idea what he's talking about. Like, this is not speaking to my soul at all. But as I've grown in my own spiritual life now, it's kind of unlocked new horizons for me. So you can see that, the kind of the maturity, spiritual maturity of Elizabeth, in that she was able to read the poetry of Thérèse and understand the spiritual depths that Thérèse is writing about, but also perhaps use that to better understand her own experiences too.
Yes. I've heard it once said that poetry is the least inadequate way of expressing the experience of God. Because the experience of God is so difficult to express, but it's the least inadequate because it gives this kind of freedom. And it does say a lot that Elizabeth would take on Thérèse's words, but of course she had her own experience. She didn't take on Thérèse's experience per se.
Right.
She had her own experience, but she saw in Thérèse's words a vehicle, to express that. And you mentioned with St. John of the Cross, like sometimes the difficulty in that. I think of Holy Mother, even when she was St. Teresa of Avila, when she was kind of having her own experience of prayer early on, all she could do with her spiritual directors is point to books and say, this is what's happening in me, because she didn't have quite the tools yet. And I wonder, maybe Elizabeth, in some way, even she had the experience, she could relate to it, she could take it on, but she maybe needed that to, kind of help her in her own development of being able to express what she was going through.
Yeah, and we see that in one passage in particular, one section of Therese's writing, more than any other, that really made an impact on St. Elizabeth, and that's the act of oblation. Could you say something about, what is the act of oblation of St. Therese?
Yeah, the act of oblation is kind of in some way, it's a synthesis of really Therese's whole spirituality, and she came to it because of kind of seeing how there's certain trends in the spirituality of her time that were making oneself a victim to God's justice, to kind of expiate the sins of France in that time, let's say, for example. And so you're trying to take on, the anger in a way, or the just wrath of God, so that others can be spared, and Thérèse saw that, there's a core of charity in that's beautiful, but it can go into some unhealthy realms and unhealthy ideas of God. And so, but Thérèse had this intuition of God as merciful love that was so important to her, that defined everything about her life. And so she intuited that who God is, and not just her own intuition, but from revelation, from her own reading, from her life in Carmel, but that God is merciful love that wants to pour himself out. That's all he desires, right, is to pour himself out. And so Thérèse says, if there are these souls that, offer themselves for justice, but God is merciful love, so much more than he is strict justice. And so why not have a soul that would offer herself to merciful love so that God could do what he wants? It could pour out his merciful love in her. And so that became this act of oblation of merciful love, became like a formula in a way to express how Thérèse saw God and her role to be this vessel for God's merciful love, and whatever that might mean for her life. It's a total gift, total unconditional offering. So that's kind of the background to then this formula that we have, where she spells out like what that means and puts it in a way that others can pray it as well. Early on she got her sister to pray it and others to pray it. So she knew it had a kind of a more universal scope than just for herself.
Right. And this is the passage of Therese's writing that we know made a very big impact on St. Elizabeth at this time. It was 1899, she's 19 years old, and she copied out this prayer, this oblation to merciful love. She copied it out on a piece of paper and folded it up so she could carry it with her at all times. So we know there was something in that was really speaking to her heart at that time and where she was spiritually. So much so that, we have some of the sort of the notes or diary entries of St. Elizabeth from that time period. and she uses a lot of the exact same words that the oblation used. And these it wasn't like, you know, she was probably sitting down with that in front of her and copying them, but she had made this so much a part of her own spirituality, prayed it so many times, that she's using these same words that we find there, such as Elizabeth writes about being a victim of Holocaust. She says, "Make me a martyr of your love." She explains, "I want to be holy for you, be my holiness, for I know my weakness." So these are all phrases that we find parallel, almost word for word, with the oblation of merciful love, which just shows the great impact that this had on her at this time.
Yes. And it really says a lot too about just Elizabeth's spirit, you know, that she was able just to assimilate these things, you know, in such a direct way that and interiorize them and really make them her own. You know, it wasn't just something she read and she liked and she got real enthusiastic about. It's just she was really able just to like make things her own in a unique way.
It reminds me of okay, so I really believe, you know, that the saints reach out to us and they choose us at different times in our life when we really need to hear whatever their message is. And I think at times we can try to force ourselves onto a saint and like, okay, I really want to like this saint, so I'm going to read a lot of this saint, but it maybe isn't speaking to me at this moment, and I try to force it. But there's something when the saint is I feel like reaching out to us, that it's almost like, you know, putting on a glove that just fits perfectly. And that's this feeling, you know, I've had it many times reading the saints, where you just read something and you're like, this is saying something about who I am, in the depth of my core of my being. It just fits. And I imagine that this is what Elizabeth was experiencing here. It's like she feels understood. She feels like suddenly it's like the lights are turned on and words are put to her own experience, her own desires.
It confirms what she's been through,
right?
And it clarifies her path. And you can say in a way too, it's like Thérèse is taking her by the hand as a teacher, you know, as a formator in that way. Just like Thérèse was formed her novices, and Lisieux is like Elizabeth became almost her novice in a certain way,
right? And maybe one thing one way this really helped Elizabeth at this time was, this is a time, you know, Elizabeth is 19. She really wants to become a Carmelite, and yet she's met this obstacle in her mother. Her mother doesn't want her to enter Carmel yet. Her mother is, you know, kind of waffling back and forth whether she's even going to let her enter Carmel at all. So I could see here too this kind of not escape in a bad way, but like here Elizabeth is in a way able to enter into Carmel through Thérèse, and live the life of Carmel here and now outside of the walls of the convent. So this is kind of this again, just this completion of who she is, and helping her to live in her current situation with peace and with trust, you know, looking ahead.
Yes, exactly. And that real abandonment that Elizabeth had to embrace, that we talked about before, you know, right. You can see that time waiting, you know, and even relating to Thérèse's experience of waiting too, you know. Yes. I mean, even on a historical level, Thérèse also had to wait, not as long as Elizabeth, but you can see a similar approach, you know, in their waiting, in their sense of waiting,
right.
Of just trying to embrace the present moment, trying to live how God wants me to right now, and not feeling like I have to wait to attain something in order to start being a Carmelite or start living as a Carmelite, you know.
Right. Yeah. And we know historically that Thérèse, you know, she first read Story of a Soul in 1899 when she was 19. She reread it again in 1900, so that was just a year later. So it was so meaningful to her that she went back to it just a year later. And then she enters Carmel, finally enters Carmel. And we continue to see then the influence that this work, in particular, the spirituality of St. Thérèse and Story of a Soul, had on her right away in her time as a postulant.
Yes. And maybe I could just, it's something that occurs to me, you know, often I think we can take St. Thérèse and think well, she's kind of for beginners, you know, you know, you might read her, you give her to someone and they really like her, and it's kind of, sometimes for some people it's like their first saint that they really approach, you know, and we can get this impression that and now I've advanced, you know, I've kind of moved beyond Thérèse, you know, and I've heard people say that, you know, and it doesn't mean we have to stick to the same thing all the time, but but it's interesting that Elizabeth didn't have that kind of elitist sense, though, of like, you know, I've read that and that was good for me when I was a kid, and now I'm a Carmelite, and now I'm really, you know, on the mountain, and I don't need Thérèse anymore. It's like, no, she still would go back, you know, rereading her.
Probably at least 4 times that she read Story of It. And she didn't live a long life. I mean, by the time she died, that book had only been out for not even 10 years, I think. So she still kept going back to it, to drink from that well.
Yes.
Return to it.
And she needed certain things at different times, you know, like in certain darker moments, in especially in Elizabeth's novitiate year, she needed that more of just trust in God's mercy when I feel like I'm a total mess or failing all the time, you know, and maybe that she wouldn't have needed that as much maybe 2 years before. She needed another thing, seeing Thérèse as a Carmelite and this merciful love. I mean, the oblation, you know what I mean? So you can go back to the same thing, but because you have different needs at different times, you know, and it can speak to you in a different way.
Yeah, it's amazing to me how much Elizabeth had already been formed by Thérèse by the time she enters Carmel. When she first enters the postulancy, they give her this questionnaire that she has to fill out, and it has all these different questions. I'm trying to remember what some of it was like. How do you perceive holiness, or like, you know, things like this, like kind of very sort of pious sort of questions to get to know the postulant a little bit better. And it's fascinating because just reading through Elizabeth's responses to that questionnaire, it's so much Thérèse. You can read so much of Thérèse in that.
Yes, totally. And what, you know, maybe are there some specifics to that questionnaire? Is there certain, you know, answers that she gave? Or
one was, I think the question had to do with like what do you see as holiness, or how to attain holiness, or something along those lines. And Elizabeth's answer is to make oneself very little, to live by love. Like this is the spirituality of Saint Thérèse, and she's been so formed in this already before she even enters Carmel, you know, in this short time. So we see that there's again this kind of something was resonating with her in this at that time.
And I would point out too that even for her mission in Carmel, you know, that it is said that Elizabeth really said that she was convinced that she offered her life for priests, and her idea of being a victim was largely focused on priests. And so even that sense of, you know, Thérèse said, I came to Carmel to save sinners and to pray for priests, you know, and that Elizabeth had that sense too in her Carmelite mission to, you know, that apostolic mission. And so, you know, when they're saying, well, why did you come? It's not just for myself, you know, but it's for others, basically. It's for the church. And so Thérèse had that, and you can see that parallel with Elizabeth in that sense too.
Right. Yeah, there's, you know, in her formation in Carmel, Elizabeth would continue to be formed by Thérèse, in a particularly interesting way, I think, because of the one who ended up being her formator, Mother Germaine. And Mother Germaine had this great devotion to Saint Thérèse. Again, very interesting because Thérèse has just died. Not a lot is, she's not known extremely well throughout the world. She's not a saint yet. She's not canonized. So, but there's something, Mother Germaine was really struck by this saint. And so she wanted to form her own postulants, her own novices in her likeness.
Yeah, and you see there too, again, God's providence in having Elizabeth discover Thérèse early on, so she could already be formed in that. Because imagine if she had gone to another Carmel that didn't know Saint Thérèse, or there were actually some Carmels that were almost opposed to her at first, you know, usually because they had a misrepresentation of Thérèse, and they saw it as like, I don't know, they saw it in different ways that thought were maybe not good for Carmelite nuns, you know, and that what a shock that would have been. But here again, God brings her into this place that it's like totally Theresian. You know, Mother Germaine she reads Thérèse and she said, this is the way, you know, and this is the way I want my Carmel to be, and this is the way I want my nuns to be formed, you know.
Right. And so much so that there was a time they had a photographer come into the Carmel and take pictures, and they had the nuns holding or having with them different things that were meaningful to them. And what Saint Thérèse, or what Mother Germaine is holding, is a copy of Story of a Soul, opened up even, I think, to a picture of Saint Thérèse. Yeah. So you can see, like, out of anything, you know, in the world, of what's most meaningful to her, that's what she has, is the story of a soul. Yes. And it's interesting too because Elizabeth is in this photo, and it's almost as though Mother Germaine is facing Thérèse towards Elizabeth in the photo. So like kind of again imparting this spirituality from Mother Germaine to to Elizabeth.
Yes, which is so bold considering Thérèse was not canonized, and especially back then, there was a real fear too. You didn't want to like do that too early with someone, for fear that it might mess up their process. Even if there's too much evidence of like public cult or too many, almost too much devotion to someone, it can raise suspicions. And so there was no like official approval yet in that sense. It was just published. It had the imprimatur, but it was just published. And yet, wow, how far, like the farsightedness of Mother Germaine to take on Thérèse in that way, and to really see her also, again, for Elizabeth in a special way, to be a role model for Elizabeth. I think, again, Elizabeth had a very difficult novitiate year, to the point where it looked like she might not even profess, which is crazy to think about, at least profess on time. And Mother Germaine knew, like, in that darkness, Elizabeth needed Thérèse more than ever. Right.
Yeah, and Mother Germaine went to such an extent that she had, in the novitiate room, she had a portrait hung up of Saint Thérèse, and said that Thérèse was the novice mistress of Lisieux and of the Dijon Carmel. So she basically was saying, Mother Germaine saying, I'm not the novice mistress, she is. Which actually reminds me, I had someone, a friend of mine, gave me a relic of Saint Thérèse to keep in my room during my novitiate, saying that she would be my novice master. So my novice mistress. So that was you. I don't know if you remember that.
I do remember it now.
Yes.
And a couple times I said, I kind of wish I had that relic, but it was worth it. It worked well. It seemed.
Yeah. So she formed me too.
and not to maybe go into a lot of detail, but you had your own personal struggles with understanding Thérèse at first, right? And so it wasn't always easy for you just to embrace Saint Thérèse.
Well, it's interesting because I found I struggled with Thérèse, but I loved Elizabeth, and Elizabeth spoke to my heart. But little did I know I was actually drinking from the well of Saint Thérèse that was passed on to me through Elizabeth. So Thérèse still got her way.
That's good to see. Good to see.
Well, maybe we can turn now to point out just maybe some specifics, if you have any specific kind of parallels between the spirituality of Saint Elizabeth and Saint Thérèse.
Yeah, well, I think a couple things. One, again, their apostolic desires. It's funny. In one of the biographies, it points out how Thérèse had her Henri Pranzini, that she was praying for, the great sinner, the great murderer, who she prayed for to be converted, and Elizabeth had a similar. She had Henri Chapuis, who was not a murderer, but he was a non-believer. I think their landlord, right?
The landlord, yeah.
Yeah, so a little different.
He lived downstairs.
Yeah, he lived downstairs. Hopefully, wasn't a criminal.
He was a hardened atheist, I guess.
Yes,
you would say.
And especially of that kind of time period in France. There's that anti-clerical element was very strong, and so he was of that other side in a sense, and she prayed for him, and actually one of their biographers point out, like, maybe even more so than Thérèse. It's interesting. So even maybe with more fervor than Thérèse. But they both, so here these two Henris, and these two young women, young saints, who were praying for them. So like you can see, I guess, a parallel in that just great desire to spread God's love and mercy to sinners, to those who at least seemed very far away.
Yeah.
And so that apostolic, I think, is one great parallel.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, the praying too for the ministers of the church, and praying for the church in that sense, that Elizabeth felt that so strongly. So that's one, I think, big parallel.
Yeah, and connected to that, Thérèse had, that she was writing letters to a seminarian. Actually 2 seminarians, right? And Elizabeth also had her seminarians too that she was writing to and praying for. So we see another parallel, and this is, it's no surprise, right? Because they're both Carmelites, and they're formed under the teaching and the spirituality of Saint Teresa of Avila, and that was one of her the real reasons why she founded the Carmelites, was to pray for priests. So that's just so written into the Carmelite spirituality, and both Elizabeth and Thérèse, they really soaked that in.
Yes, definitely. And actually, I think it's Mother Germaine who points out that Elizabeth kind of came to understand in a lot of ways the work of St. Teresa of Avila through the lens of St. Therese. That Therese was kind of a contemporary translation in a way of what Teresa of Avila was all about, and especially the way of perfection, which we know is like, as novices we read that over and over and over again, and it's kind of the formation handbook of the Carmelites, but Elizabeth was able to receive that because of her knowledge of Therese in a way, that the way of perfection even was mediated through Therese's kind of path, I guess you could say, of living that out, that Mother Germaine promoted so much as novice mistress and superior.
Yeah. One other area of the spirituality that struck me about kind of a parallel here, I think something that really spoke to Elizabeth was the radicality of the call that Saint Therese experienced. It's like to this totality. It's like this I'm giving all of myself to this Jesus whom I love. So just the kind of radical nature of that self-gift. But connected with that is this desire, this lofty desire to be a saint, to give yourself to him, but also this awareness that I'm weak and I can't do this on my own. And so Jesus must do it in me.
Yes.
And we see that same boldness. It's a boldness and desire, but also a great trust in the mercy of God to bring it about. This great confidence in the mercy of God to bring it about. And we see that in Elizabeth as well. She is, again, just when you read her, there's just something so radical. She's going to stop at nothing to reach this goal of her heart, which is to be all consumed by the love of God.
Yes. And it's not just a sentimental thing, it's not, I mean, maybe that's just a given. You could say, well, she's saying, of course it's not sentimental, but I think we so often see that as like a fervor, or something, or just like, I wish I could just like feel that or be in that state. But it was just this total decision, and to do it in a way that was ordinary, not seeking the extraordinary. Not seeking like great lofty things or thoughts or feelings, but just, this total response to God's love in the midst of just the ordinary daily, struggles, basically, and being able to reconcile those realities, and as you mentioned, like just seeing one's own poverty and then letting that turn one to trust. There's a great quote, actually, I like to read, where Elizabeth writes to her sister in this very Theresian way. She says, "Oh, my sister, never have I felt my poverty so much. Never have I seen myself so wretched. But this misery doesn't at all weigh me down. To the contrary, I make use of it to go to him." And I think right there is such the essence of both of their paths.
When you point out that this wasn't just a kind of sentimental, this was so real in them. It's so apparent in both their lives because they both went through periods of great darkness and trial. Elizabeth, during the time of her novitiate, really the whole year of her novitiate was just a great trial. She was in great darkness about, she wasn't filled with these great feelings in prayer or these great feelings in living her life. It was just, she was just left in the kind of the darkness of faith. And then Therese experienced something very different, or very similar the last few months of her life. Again, kind of left in this state of darkness and clinging only to faith. So we see in both of them the authenticity, because it wasn't just these great feelings. They had none of that, and yet they were faithful. Yet they continued to strive. They continued to do all they can to reach their beloved. And so it teaches us, right? No matter what the situation is, whether I feel just completely enveloped in my misery, my weakness, my sin, whether I have just totally dry prayer, whether I'm struggling to love, my family, my spouse, my coworkers, whatever it is, it's not about these good feelings, but it's about remaining faithful and still seeking God and trying to love him in the midst of that and allowing him to raise you out of that.
And I think that is so key, allowing him, it's putting the emphasis on God, it's putting it on him in that way, that we don't have to get ourselves out of it. And like even with Elizabeth, I like how she said it doesn't weigh me at all down. So it doesn't have to like depress us or make us feel like discouraged in any way, you know. But it's just an impetus then to, in the midst of that, to not get down on oneself, but to just put it on God. That God, you must do it, you know. And again, with the oblation of merciful love, I think Elizabeth gelled so well with that idea of like, God, you have to yourself be my sanctity. You know, it's a springboard. Our misery becomes a springboard in that way, of confidence that you yourself have to do it. And I have so much trust in you that you will clothe me with yourself. Whereas Elizabeth says, to identify my soul with all the movements of your soul, you know, to overwhelm me, to possess me, says to substitute yourself for me, that my life may be a radiance of your life. So it's just, it's putting it all on God, I guess. Yeah. You know, where it just comes out so strongly in both of them.
Yes. Yeah, and speaking of all these things, these parallels, I feel like, I mean, really what we're describing here is the little way of Saint Therese, which Elizabeth very clearly was a student of and had integrated into her own spiritual life. And if we were to stop here, I think we would maybe give the impression that Elizabeth was basically just another Therese.
Yes.
And I think that would be a big mistake to understand Elizabeth that way. So we see, you know, the incredible influence that Therese, the parallels in their biography, their life, their context, their spirituality. We see the influence that Elizabeth had on Therese. But I think it'd be a mistake to stop there and say that Elizabeth is just restating or reliving the message of Therese. Because Elizabeth really had something original and something of her own. So maybe we can say something here about maybe some of the originality of Elizabeth or the differences in their spiritualities.
Sure. Yeah, well, I think, you know, for one, to say that when Elizabeth discovered Therese, again, she was 19. So she had already passed through like many, you know, steps in the spiritual life. You know, she had already had her conversion, you know, was praying every day, you know, really trying to live, already sensed her call to Carmel. So yeah, it wasn't like Therese just gave her this conversion, let's say, or gave her this like total new vista in the spiritual life, you know, and it's very important, I think, to see that Elizabeth had this core. Therese didn't change her direction, but it confirmed this path that she had already been traveling on, you know, and so yeah, that originality of Elizabeth, you don't, and I love Saint Therese, of course, but in our zeal for Saint Therese, we don't want to make it seem like that Elizabeth, like there would be no Elizabeth without Therese, kind of thing, you know, and it because that's just not the reality that she helped her very much, but Elizabeth, you know, Jesus was working directly in Elizabeth's soul, you know, and before Elizabeth found Therese, she would always talk about Jesus is my master. Jesus teaches me everything interiorly, you know.
Right.
So it's just there's so much going on in Elizabeth prior to Therese that we don't want to give that impression.
Could you say something too about like perhaps their context, their upbringing, like their different personalities too? Because I think that is significant here. If they're two different people.
Yeah. Yes, for sure.
Like to the end.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like just how they grew up, you know. Although both lost a parent, you know, which is you know, I'm sure that they share that in common, that wound, you know. But then the way that they grew up was so different, you know. Like just Madame Catez was taking her girls all around France, you know, and just into Switzerland and different places, socializing with everyone, you know. Whereas Therese didn't have that so much, you know. She stayed in her own very familiar circle, and she herself, you know, with her own kind of woundedness before her conversion, you know, she didn't always feel comfortable, let's say, with just other random people, and so I think their socialization, you know, was very different.
Right. Yeah, we see, you know, Elizabeth at 21 years old going to these parties and dancing with young men, and it's just something I cannot imagine Therese doing. Of course, Therese entered Carmel at a very young age, so she had a different life.
Sure.
But just there's a difference in personality there, which I think is significant for the way that they understood their spiritual lives and also the way they expressed that spiritual life in their writing.
Yeah, definitely. And they were both so relational. They both had that gift of relationship, of friendship. Yeah. But Elizabeth's blossomed in a different way, and it blossomed before Carmel. Whereas in Thérèse's case, like a lot kind of blossomed almost after Carmel, in Carmel and after Carmel.
Right.
So you have that sense, but like they expressed it in very different ways. They expressed it in very different ways.
One thing that I think we're really wanting to stress during this season, and I think we started out with this even in our first episode of like, what is it that Elizabeth really has to offer people? And I think a lot of the reason that we want Elizabeth to be more well known in the world is because she had this great, what we would call like a lay spirituality, in that she felt the call to union with God and was striving for it and living it in the context of the world before she entered Carmel. Yeah. She had already kind of reached great maturity in her spirituality before Carmel, living in the midst of a normal daily life. And so that's something that Elizabeth can offer, a spirituality that Elizabeth can offer that Thérèse can't so much entering Carmel at such a young age.
Sure. Yeah, and you can see how like Thérèse is, once she entered Carmel, people have taken her writings, her letters, and of course you can apply it in many different ways, in a lay way. I mean, lay spirituality, lay people love Saint Thérèse, right? I mean, They find very much strength to follow their path through it. But she doesn't have that same kind of like lay spirituality per se that you could say Elizabeth has.
Right.
Even though people see sometimes Elizabeth is almost like beyond them or something. Whereas no, she actually has more of a lay spirituality than almost any mystic
right.
that we could name.
Yeah, she shows that it's possible to be called to and to respond to this call to live in complete union with God in the midst of our normal daily lives.
Yes.
One thing that's really interesting to me is seeing, this time period where we talked about where Elizabeth is very influenced by Thérèse. She's either quoting Thérèse or especially like using a lot of the same terminology as Thérèse during this time. And then we get, as she progresses closer and closer to the end of her life, when she's 25, 26 years old, when she's in the infirmary especially, we see some of that kind of fading away. It's not that she's like changed her spirituality or anything. She still is using the some of the same terms, same concepts, but it's like more of this originality of Elizabeth is shining forth now. It's like the Thérèse was kind of the foundations that she needed to stand on in order to come to her own sort of spirituality. And so when we get to the writing at the end of Elizabeth's life, and if we were to sit down and compare that with the writing of Thérèse, suddenly you see two very different works.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing in particular that strikes me is maybe speaking from again their own context, their own background, their own gifts. Elizabeth was a really bright, very intellectual, I would say, and she's quoting a lot in her writing. St. Paul, she's quoting tons of scripture. She's quoting some theologians, some Dominicans. So there tends to be this. Just a different feel to her writings than reading the writings of Saint Thérèse.
Yes, and I think Thérèse, like, she saw it so much as her mission to not depart from anything ordinary, and to just make things like as simple as possible in a way.
Right.
And Thérèse herself is many would say she was a genius, but not in the sense, not in the kind of other sense. Like we know she like as a child she was a voracious reader, let's say, and she too quotes, like she brings in a lot of quotes from scripture and especially the Gospels, Old Testament, but yeah, she doesn't. It's like she's striving in a way to just like be as ordinary as possible in her writing, and in that gospel, just like that more like kind of pure gospel sort of simplicity in a way, evangelical simplicity, I think was Thérèse's goal in her writing.
Yeah.
Whereas Elizabeth, like she much more freely kind of incorporated like different theologians that she had heard or that she had been taught by. Different mystics, from other tradition. You think of like Roysbrook and others, so she was able to weave things in a different way and kind of with a different emphasis.
And it's not like Elizabeth is this complicated scholastic theologian necessarily, but she's talking about very complex spiritual ideas, such as, I'm very Trinitarian, but she talks a lot about the incarnation, about predestination. She's very influenced by St. Paul's letters, which go into some rather complicated theological topics. And Elizabeth's kind of just diving right into those, where, like you said, Thérèse is really just sticking to the essential core of the gospel in a very simple way. And even the way they express that is very different, right? So I've heard it said that Thérèse is very visual in the way that she thinks, whereas Elizabeth was a musician, and so she's very auditory. And so the way that she thinks about things is more in terms of music and sound and noise, whereas Thérèse has these images that she uses and parables. So it's just they're using the gifts that God's given them and presenting their message in different ways.
Yes. And maybe you could say, like, who that attracts to sometimes is different, Thérèse is, I don't know if you could speak maybe a little bit about, like, Thérèse, the people that maybe are drawn to Thérèse, and then others who are drawn to both of them, but maybe some that are also drawn to Elizabeth that might not be as drawn to Thérèse. Right,
and maybe just because of the simplicity of Thérèse's message, it's like she speaks to everyone, right? There's something about her that's so universal, and no matter, if someone is just, like, being awakened to their spiritual life, or someone's well advanced in their spiritual life, like Thérèse is right there, giving that core gospel message to them. Whereas Elizabeth is interesting. I mean, I guess I wish Elizabeth was more well known and more loved, and I think we're hoping that to be a part of that, making that happen. But it is interesting that a lot of people who are very devoted to Elizabeth tend to be, I know, a lot of diocesan priests, Dominican priests, also a lot of lay people too, but maybe she speaks more to those who are already a little further along in their spiritual life. Not saying they're like, advanced in their spiritual life. You have to be advanced in your spiritual life. But I'd say, like, anyone who's watching something like this, that you've already been awakened to these realities of prayer and of a desire for union with God. And so Elizabeth is speaking to that person.
Yeah, you might have started watching this. We wouldn't have gotten to this point.
Exactly. if you're still with us at this point, Elizabeth is speaking to you. Yes.
But no, it's very true. And I think it's people too who are drawn to a more like a sense of call, maybe to an interior prayer, a real interior prayer, a real desire to embrace the path of recollection. And so people are drawn in that direction, whether they're whatever state of life they're in.
Yes.
But there's people out there who just feels very drawn to that way, a contemplative way of life, you could say, and I think Elizabeth speaks very poignantly to that, to those desires, and there's not a lot. She's very accessible too with that. So even though she's in a way universal in her contemplative, very interior kind of mission.
Right.
And maybe you could say that's a sort of a difference too, in that way of what their mission was, and how Elizabeth did have a distinct mission. That's a more like interior kind of emphasis on union with God, and the kind of the interior prayer, recollection, how that can be lived in whatever circumstance you're in.
Yeah, there's the great scene, when Elizabeth is dying, she's laying in the infirmary, and Mother Germaine, who loves Saint Thérèse, goes to her and says, "Well, when you go to heaven, is your mission going to be the same as Thérèse?" Because Thérèse had expressed in her writing that when she goes to heaven, her mission is going to be doing good on earth. That's going to be her sending down these flowers to earth. And Elizabeth was very kind of blunt in her answer. She said, "No, that's not going to be my mission." She said, "My mission is going to be to attract souls to interior recollection." She wants to draw them inward. And that's what she saw as her whole spirituality, I think, can be summed up in there. So you see these, I mean, not that one is better than the other, they're very complementary, but you see these kind of two movements in the spiritual life between Thérèse and Elizabeth.
Yes.
And so you can see just the originality there in what it is that Elizabeth's trying to do.
Yes. And I think that, again, that can help us too, in a way of just seeing that, like, we do all have a core, and it's not another person, and it's not another saint even, that we can find, our path. Like, we really do all have a unique path. And even one of our saints, Saint Edith Stein, in her philosophical works, kind of unpacks that. How, like, there's a certain core to the person that nothing else can enter except God,
And it's totally unique to that person. Like, so totally unique that it's not copied anywhere else.
Yes.
That God has imparted each person with this very, very special and just divine calling that we should respond to.
Yes, and that's what he wants. He doesn't want another Thérèse. He doesn't want another Elizabeth. He wants you. He wants us. He wants us to be who we're supposed to be, and we can find in the saints great support for that. And I think all of us, and probably many listening here, have found in Carmelite spirituality, like, wow, such an impetus, such a strength, such a support, but it's limited still. It's limited in the sense that you can't just take it on. You can't just absorb it and make it yourself somehow. Like, you have your own original core that needs to blossom and flourish in the way that God desires. And these saints, especially the ones that come onto your path, will help you with that. But it's not like you can just read them and then just be that.
Right. Yeah, and that's why, that just shows the holiness of Elizabeth, and that she was able to be influenced by Thérèse. Again, something was speaking to that depth of that core of who she is, and yet she was able to flourish and blossom, and as she actually, as Elizabeth, that's who she was called to be, and that's who, thank God that we're able to then soak into the core of who we are in order to express our own call in the spiritual life. I do want to mention before we finish a particular book. This is a book called Two Sisters in the Spirit by von Balthasar. And a lot of people, and myself included, when I saw this, I was so excited because it's a book talking about St. Thérèse and St. Elizabeth. And I was very excited when I first saw it because I was like, I thought it would be kind of what we're talking about here today. I was a little disappointed because it turns out what it is actually is von Balthasar has a whole treatise on Elizabeth, on Thérèse. That's most of the book. And then after that, he has a short section or treatise on Elizabeth. So it's not so much a comparative work talking about the two together, like their differences and similarities and things. It's more like, here's Thérèse, here's Elizabeth. It's good in that that's what it is. But it's not so much this kind of comparative, putting the two in dialogue, which is, I think, what I was hoping it would really be when I saw the title and saw the book.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot out there that does that. And I had this similar experience, and from what I've read as well, he can kind of put his lens on certain things. I mean, von Balthasar is a great theologian, so he has a very strong ideas about certain things, certain concepts in the spiritual life, especially that it seems like he does impose those in certain ways on Elizabeth and Thérèse. And so it's not necessarily going to be, this totally objective, let's say, presentation of their spiritualities.
Yeah. And actually, I think what I found really helpful in my own thought on this is there's a great 2-volume works by a woman named Joanne Moseley on Elizabeth. There's 2 volumes, and it's called Elizabeth of the Trinity, The Unfolding of Her Message. And I think that just because of the way that she's approaching Elizabeth, even though it's mainly about Elizabeth, you get a lot of the influence of Thérèse, and you see that come out a lot. So I found something like this a lot more helpful for really digging into that comparative reality between the two saints.
Yes.
All right, great. Well, we thank you so much for joining us. Know of our prayers throughout this week, and we look forward to seeing you next week. God bless you.